Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
What really landed in Rendlesham Forest in England in 1980? Why have some of the principal witnesses changed their stories over the years? Did American military personnel really see alien entities?
Hello, and welcome to the 994th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you from WON, AM, and FM radio here in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live, on YouTube and via TuneIn.com. I'm Ben, and that was Paul, and today we bring you a well-known guest with a new take on an old subject. You can join us from anywhere. You can call us 401-766-1240 or email Paul at BehindTheParanormal.com.
Actually, the email is still having a problem.
So do not do that.
I can get it in my lair at home, but I can't. None of the devices we have here in the studio will pick it up.
Well, when in doubt, there's
We're
always
working on it.
Facebook Messenger.
Yes, definitely. So anyway, Ben is working diligently to connect with our overseas guest.
Wouldn't be
who,
live radio without a little bit of drama,
right.
folks.
Retired British police detective and Royal Air Force veteran Gary Hasseltine is vice president of the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research, or ICER, composed of scientists, academics, and leading UFO UAP researchers worldwide. Using skills learned as a police officer, Gary has examined cases with the best evidence, often corroborated by technology. In 2002, he founded the database Police Reporting UFO Sightings, or PRUFOS, P-R-U-F-O-S. That's available online. At the citizens' hearings on UFO disclosure in Washington, D.C., Gary has testified on behalf of police officers worldwide who are UFO witnesses. He is founder and editor of the monthly magazine UFO Truth, to which I have contributed a modest article previously. Gary's new book, Non-Human, The Rendlesham Forest Incidents, 42 Years of Denial, is the result of a 5-year-plus reinvestigation of Britain's most famous UFO event. Gary participated in our own lengthy series of CBS radio specials on the Rendlesham case in 2010 and 2011. Today marks his 9th appearance on Behind the Paranormal. We hope Ben can connect with him here. His website, ufotruthmagazine.co.uk. All right, so as we wait for Gary to join us, he's never failed to do so yet.
Sure thing.
And I can begin with the subject of Rendlesham Forest for some people say 4 nights, and Gary will go into this more fully. In December of 1980, U.S. Air Force personnel witnessed strange lights in the sky, supposedly craft landing, and by some reports, alien entities coming from those craft. Now, Rendlesham Forest, one of our flap areas that Ben and I investigate, though we haven't been there since 2012, it isn't all that big, really. It's a forested area that's now what we in America would call open space land. It's public land. People can go and hike and take walks and walk their dogs, etc. As a matter of fact, the main trail is called the UFO Trail because of the famous case that took place there. In 1980, it was straddled by 2 NATO air bases, Bentwaters, RAF Bentwaters, and RAF Woodbridge. Now, RAF Woodbridge, as I understand it, is still open as a helicopter base for the British military. And Bentwaters, I might have it reversed. Anyway, one of them is open, and the other is has been the kind of. Oh no! Wait a minute. I think one of them is an industrial park. Anyway, one of them is closed, supposedly, and we were there again some years ago in 2012. Now, we often have Steve LaPlume, who is an official co-host of the show here. Okay.
I'm just using your face to unlock the phone.
Oh, okay.
Thank
I
you.
think you have to do it. Okay. Yeah, Ben is frantically communicating with Gary over Facebook Messenger. But in any case, quite a few personnel were involved in seeing these things. Lights were seen in the sky, as I say. One of the most famous incidents was the Deputy Base Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, who also participated in our special series in 2010 and 2011. Oh, there he is.
There we are. We did it.
I've just done it. Look at that, the beauties of technology, my iPhone.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi, Gary. Yeah, we introduced you already, and you had our blood pressure going there. So I was starting to explain the Rendlesham case, but I'm going to turn that over to you.
Okay.
So we got as far as Colonel Halt's tape.
Oh, there's so much more that we're going to talk about.
Oh, there is. Well, go for it.
The floor is yours.
Okay. I appreciate that it's not maybe the best quality, but that's my iPhone, so
No,
it's
you're
better
fine.
than nothing. Right. My book, Non-Human, is really the result of 5 years reinvestigation of the whole case. I've been doing research on the case public research since 2007. And it was only when I was asked to take part in a documentary 6 years ago that I began to think about it. And I thought, well, if I'm going to get involved, it needs to be accurate. So I then decided to do what can only be described as a deep dive into Rendlesham Forest. And the beauty of that was that I just never realised how much information there was. And then how do you, I'll put it into a book and, kind of formatted it. There's so much information. There's so much disinformation. So what I decided to do was use it as like a forensic exercise. From my point of view as a former advanced interviewer, police detective, etc., and basically just look for the facts and then evaluate the facts that I found and then give an assessment. And that's the approach that I've adopted, and that's what I've done. And 500 pages is the book, and it's been out now 7 or 8 weeks now on Amazon. I released it with no pre-publicity whatsoever, and that was deliberate because I wanted to get the truth out there. And what I mean by that is I wanted to get the information out there, and once the genie is out of the bottle, it's hard to put back in the bottle. And there's so many agendas, I think, that are at work with Rendlesham over the years that I just felt that was the best way to get the information out there. And then once it's out, then you can start talking about it. But it's so much harder for people who may wish to not want this information out there to get it out there.
Now, you start the book with a general accepted chronology. Can you start us off with that?
Okay, yeah. Prior to 2017, the existing chronology was basically that there'd been 3 nights of continuous UFO activity in the forest, and there were night 1 was the night of Christmas night into Boxing Day, 25th into 26th, and that's the well-known story of Jim Penniston and John Burroughs and Ed Kabanzak, the small triangular object found on the ground or at or near to the ground in a small clearing in the forest. That's regarded as night 1. Much less was known about night 2, but it's generally perceived to have happened, and that was something that happened to Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, a young female black officer who was one of the shift commanders, and something that really traumatizing had happened to her, but we didn't really know what. There was no accurate information. And then the third night would have been what was regarded to as what's called the Holt Night. The Holt Night, where Colonel Holt went out with a small team, 5 including himself, according to Holt, and he then saw, and they did multiple UFOs themselves. He took out with him a small dictaphone audio recording device, and he made, according to him, intermittent updates, and that's what's called the Holt tape. And then after the incident, he was then asked to write a memorandum to the Ministry of Defence, because effectively the incidents had occurred on British soil. So he did a one-page memo, which has become known, a very famous document called the Holt Memorandum. And basically he's passed that to Squadron Leader Morland, who was the RAF liaison officer on the twin bases, who then passed it forward up the chain to the Ministry of Defence. And then the Ministry of Defence basically never responded to him, according to Colonel Holt. And basically that was it. He never got any feedback. So that was the existing chronology which begins the book. And I call it the origins part of the story. Where do you want me to go from there?
Well, what did you find that was wrong with that chronology? And if you could get into the initial witness statements as well, which you do in the book.
Yeah. Well, what didn't emerge initially were any statements, and then I think it was really in the James Easton got hold of what are regarded as the 5 statements that I referred to in the book. These are the existing statements, and they were apparently originally annotated by what is believed to be Colonel Holt, and we think that they came from Colonel Holt. He had copies of them, and I review those in the book. Now, as a former police officer, RAF police officer, detective, statements are quite an important thing, and the long and short of it is I go through the statements with a fine-tooth comb, and there's a lot wrong with them. They themselves have said some of them they didn't write, which alludes to that there were other organisations, agencies involved that were wanting to put out a different story, which I think was the case. But basically, none of the statements are really written that well in terms of my kind of training, and I don't think there'll be that much difference. And they're not really exhibited in the right way. But what you've got to understand is that when we have procedures in kind of policing terms for just about every incident, the one area that you don't have any kind of set rules is when it comes to UFOs. And it's like when there's a UFO incident, the rules tend to go out the window. And I think that's basically what happened with these statements, and the fact that they weren't written properly, they weren't written in the right format, etc., etc. So that's where you are. I think across the board, when you look at major UFO cases, rules tend to go completely out the window, and things disappear, and pages of logs get suddenly disappear mysteriously. Ship records suddenly fly out the window into the sea, and that kind of thing. So, or helicopters turn up, like with the Nimitz incident, and the tapes kind of like get taken away by unknown persons. So, when we're talking UFOs, it all falls into this big, deep black hole where it's very easy for any serious researcher to establish that there's been a cover-up. And I think if you look at recent people like Ross Coulthard, who've come to the subject only recently and did a very good book once he did get into it, he has been amazed at just how much credible information is out there. So I think the cover-up is well established, and it's only really been held in place by the media, unfortunately, who still are dragging their heels. But I think that will eventually crack around them quite soon. I think we're on the brink of something. It might not seem it, but I think we're on the brink of something.
No, I tend to agree. I was reading this article, and it was talking about the death of BuzzFeed News, and how essentially that's kind of like a big sign of the times that there's all these news, legacy news and all these other outlets that are just kind of falling by the wayside as time goes on. And it's interesting stuff because it makes you feel like we're on the brink of something. But I want to take a quick step back because I know we've done a million shows in Rendlesham Forest, even been there. But I'm struggling to remember.
You want to know about the new stuff? That's what you want to know.
That's exactly, exactly. So the statements themselves was it really long after the fact that those appeared? Because I'm struggling to remember how long it was after.
I've got a feeling it was in the 1990s that they emerged, so many years afterwards.
Oh yeah.
Through James Easton's interviews. But basically, the statements in policing terms are very poor. They're very inconsistent. They're not really formatted properly on the American statement forms that they should have used. If, for example, if you do a drawing or make notes on just a scrap of paper, that can still be a statement in a sense because that's the first thing that you wrote down. So that's valuable. But what you then should do is then rewrite the statement on the proper statement forms, and then you make that original piece of paper an exhibit. Say, for example, Gary Heseltine would be GH1, and you would say, on such and such a day, I wrote these notes out on a piece of paper, which I exhibit as GH1, and that would form a part of the body of the official statement, if you see what I mean. Because things are formatted in official documents because they're intended at some point, generally, to be presented in court. That's why we have documents.
Right, yeah.
Unfortunately, when we talk about UFOs, we're not going to be in a courtroom situation, but from the Air Force's point of view, they would have had official records so that if there had been a criminal aspect to anything, if it had been a murder or something within the US Air Force, they would have had procedures and paperwork that all had to be filled in properly. Well, the actual statements that emerged are very poor, and for me, they're not worth the paper they're written on. So that, I wouldn't really hold too much of that. There's only one that's really formatted properly, which was Chandler's. But again, there's lots of inconsistencies with all of them. But I don't want to get bogged down in the statements because that's not really the big story. The big story is what's emerged through my 5 years reinvestigation.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, okay, let's have a list. Let's start chronologically. The biggest thing that I found when I did the deep dive was I went down and tried to find everything written about the case after the case. So literally from January 1981 onwards. And of course, there wasn't much at first, but within a few days, the likes of Brenda Butler and Dot Street were becoming aware that something had happened on the base. Later, they get involved with a famous UFO researcher in the UK called Jenny Randalls. That then leads them to go into the forest and making early indications, and those early indications are all traced in the book. But cutting a long story short, what emerges in terms of what I think was quite startling information when I delved deep into this historical information, a lot of which I knew, but a lot of which I didn't know. The first thing that really hit me was that I obtained 4 sources that said that Colonel Holt tried to sell his story to the News of the World before the News of the World article that came out in October 93, in 83. All right? And the 4 sources, basically, one of which included a skeptic astronomer called Ian Ridpath, all confirmed that that Keith Beebe, the journalist behind that very famous headline, UFO lands in Suffolk, and it's official, that big article that set it around the world, which occurred on the 2nd of October 1983. Actually, in the run-up to that, Keith Beebe did a number of lectures, and one of which was attended by Ian Ridpath, this astronomer in the UK, and he verifies it in a message to a UFO publication and says, I was there when Keith Beebe said that he was in negotiation with Colonel Holt. Now, what the interesting thing about this is Colonel Holt is still in the Air Force. This is he doesn't retire until 1991. But I have 4 credible sources that say he was prepared or in negotiation. And the reason it fell through is because the Holt Memorandum surfaced and the News of the World said, we can't hang on to this any longer. Holt had said to Keith Beebe, the journalist, the same journalist who did the article that spread it around the world, Keith Beebe, he basically said, we can't hold on to this. It's an incredible document. We've got to publish it. And he'd said, well, I can't publish this material until I'm out of the Air Force. So this was like a pre-retirement deal that he was working on. I don't know for how much, but it probably would be for a lot of money, but I don't know. But the key thing is there's 4 independent sources that say that he was prepared to sell his story, and actually included some documents as well. Jenny Randles, the famous author and UFO researcher in the UK, in the 80s and 90s particularly, she said that Keith Beebe allowed her to view very briefly a file of the negotiated material that he was preparing for that sale to the newspaper. And she wasn't allowed to make any notes, but she looked at it and sees a number of things that Holt was prepared to give to the News of the World, should the story have broken when he retired. But unfortunately, it broke many years early.
Now, you and I have both been in the military, Gary. The fact that he was still in and was going to sell a story tells me that there was some authorization there. And umpteen interviews we've done with him, I've never been able to get this out of him, that he was authorized to sell something, some story to the newspaper.
Yeah, you don't sell government documents willy-nilly.
No, he's
absolutely.
in serious trouble.
He
and
was
lost his
absolutely
retirement.
taking a massive risk talking about it.
Yeah. So,
but nevertheless, the 4 sources, had there have been just one source, had there been just 2 sources, I wouldn't have put it in the book. But when you had 4 different sources saying the same thing, and then somebody who would be regarded as a skeptic, Ian Ridpath, an astronomer in the UK, who's famous for putting forward the lighthouse theory. He was the person that really created the lighthouse theory that still dogs the case. So he was a skeptic, and so there was no pro-UFO bias with him. And for him to say it in a letter to the editor of the UFO publication, I thought that was pretty startling and added even extra credence to it. So that's a major thing. But one of the biggest things that I researched and was very fortunate to get hold of was a well-known UFO researcher in MUFON, who called Ray Boucher, and his then partner, colleague, Scott Colburn, who sadly passed away in the last couple of years. But they worked on trying to figure out Rendlesham between 1984 and 1986. And I did a Skype interview with Ray Boucher for the first time in 2018. And I said to him, I don't suppose you've got any of your Rendlesham notes still? And he went, yeah, I've got them all somewhere. And I thought, well, yeah, you know, a lot of people might say that. But I said, well, any chance of you having a look for them and see what you can find? And he went, yeah, I'll do that. Well, cutting a long story short, 2 weeks later, he then says, yeah, I found them all. And I've kind of scanned them all, and I've made a PDF document, and I'm sending it all to you. Well, this PDF document came, and it was 345 pages of their entire Rendlesham research, which was like 3 years' work.
Wow.
And anyway, I was so excited, I read it in one go, because it was old material, and a lot of people hadn't never seen this. And anyway, when I was going through it, something actually leapt off the page that to this day is pretty incredible, and it's the second big chronological thing to find in the old material, which is where he says that he had been investigating Rendlesham. He'd spoken to Larry Warren, he'd spoken to Adrian Bustinza, he'd spoken to another members of other military witnesses, and he'd built up an idea of what had occurred. And he'd published various things in UFO journals and things like that, but it wasn't like the media now where stuff goes around and you get big audiences. It was a pretty small document. So anyway, when he's done this, he thinks what his motivation is that Scott Colburn and Ray Boucher lived in the state of Nebraska. And because the Rendlesham case involved American servicemen, and he was very interested in UFOs, he thought that his senator, Senator James Exon, should be interested because Exon was a long-time senator and on the Armed Services Committee. And he basically approached Exon and said, look, are you aware of this case that's happened in the UK? And I think at first Exon was like, no, I'm not really interested. And he said, well, if I get you more information, more credence, will you look into it? Because it's involving American servicemen. And eventually Exon was intrigued enough to meet with them, and they gave him copies of the Holt Memorandum and the tape, etc. So he got kind of interested. Well, he still wanted a bit more. So Ray Boucher decided to ring Colonel Holt. This is in 1985. All right, so he rings Colonel Holt out of the blue. And he says, I'm Ray Boucher, I work for MUFON, I'm a UFO researcher, blah, blah, blah. And he basically lays out the following scenario to Colonel Holt. He said that basically there'd been maybe a number of landings, but there was a landing that involved a number of security policemen surrounding an object that was on the ground, a landed object, that it was being filmed on motion picture cameras, as in moving footage, as in video stroke cine film, and that the base commander, Gordon Williams, of the guy responsible for the twin bases, was present at this scene. And when he laid out all those circumstances, bear in mind, Holt is still in the Air Force, and probably the first time, other than Dot Street and Brenda Butler, that he'd had any kind of communication with anybody about the case. He says this. He says, I can verify all of that. Yes, I can verify all of that for the senator. So he laid it all out there. And the thing that made it absolutely crystal clear is that Ray Boucher wrote it down verbatim, his response. And basically it starred it and said verbatim. So this is a direct question where he's laid out the scenario, asked him that question and asked for his opinion, and he says, yeah, I can verify all of that basically for the senator, as in Senator James Exon. Now, that was an admission that was made in 1985, right? And when I read that as a former detective, and the fact that it had been written down verbatim, I went, what? Literally leapt off the page, because Holt has always denied, and denied it to me for many years during our 7-year collaboration, that Colonel Williams was there, that it was being filmed, that there'd been any second landing. And here he was in 1985, while he was still serving in the Air Force. So before he became this public personality linked to this very famous case, there he was, still serving, saying to a MUFON investigator, yes, I can verify all of that. And let's, for the skeptics out there, will say, well, no, he's misinterpreted what Boucher had said. No, he didn't. And the reason why he didn't was because Ray Boucher subsequently found out, after that admission, that Colonel Holt had gone to see Senator Exon. And he wasn't present, nor was Scott Colburn. But what happened was, as soon as Holt has seen Exon, James Exon, nobody wants to talk. Exon doesn't want to talk to Scott or Ray anymore. And obviously, Ray is very frustrated, so he starts writing letter after letter after letter to the senator's office and his aides, etc., trying to get hold of Exon. He never speaks with Exon again. Holt and his aides completely block him, basically. But what's important are these letters. The letters, which were part of the bundle that I got, the 345 pages, are amazing because they're long letters, and they lay out in very specific paragraphs, and a couple of the letters are actually in the book at the end, and they lay it out exactly the circumstances that were put to Holt, and the fact that Holt said, yes, Colonel Williams was there, yes, it was being filmed on motion picture footage, that it was surrounded by a security police officer, and there had been a second landing. Wow. And it's absolutely not ambiguous whatsoever. That's what Holt admitted to. And yet, ever since he retired in 1991, he has said that Colonel Williams wasn't there wasn't a second landing, and he attacked continuously Larry Warren. Now, here's the interesting thing: is I never could quite understand why he was so. During my 7 years of collaboration with him, I never quite understand why he was so anti Larry Warren. But interestingly, we now know why. I think is because of a guy called Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. Adrian Bustinza was U.S. Security Police Officer, Sergeant, and when I originally met Colonel Holt in 2007 and asked him if he would work with me on like a potential film script, which is another story, but basically, when he said yes, I said, right, I'm going to go away, research things. This is 2007. And when I come back, I'm going to start asking you questions. And, just reply. And he said, yeah, fair enough. Well, one of the things that I said was, who were the people that were with you in your small group that went out in the forest on your night? And he'd go, well, there was obviously me, there was Munro Nevels, the disaster preparedness, there was Robert Ball, and there was Lieutenant England, and it kind of went silent then. And yet the audio is very specific. It's Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. And I said, it's Sergeant Adrian. Oh, yes, yeah. And it's like he didn't want to admit that Bustinza was with him. Now, the question is, it always rankled me, why? Well, the real answer is now because Adrian Bustinza was a very reluctant witness. He'd gone on twice onto the Phenomenal Radio show with John Burroughs in later years, but had never really given a proper statement. He'd given some social media comments over the years to various people, and in the chat, there's a chapter devoted to Sergeant Adrian Bustinza in the book, and it's the longest chapter, and it's because of his, I think, unique role, because I see him as the link person to this second landing. Now, Adrian Bustinza had first given an interview to Larry Fawcett in 1984. It's one of the first incidents. Larry Fawcett, who with Barry Greenwood wrote the book Clear Intent, a very good book, with a chapter on Rendlesham. It was the first time there was a devoted chapter. Now, what's good about this is that when we get into this story of whether there was a second landing, the second landing scenario had been put forward by Larry Warren. But he had been public on his own for 8 years until the likes of Colonel Holt retired in 1991. I think we're coming up to a break. Do you want me to suspend it there?
Yes, we'll take our 3/4.
All right. And I'll tell you what happened.
Break.
It's fascinating.
Yes, and then we'll be back.
A little bit of a cliffhanger.
You're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM, 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley. We'll be right back with our old friend Gary Hesseltine in just a minute.
Hey, it's ON Radio's Cruisin' Bruce Palmer inviting you to join me for the Saturday Block Party. It's every Saturday from 4 until 7 p.m. when we fill the airwaves with the songs you want to hear. It's a party in every sense of the word, so join me live on 99.5 and 1240 a.m. or bring the show with you wherever you go at onworldwide.com.
You can depend on us for public service, ON Radio.
And welcome back to Behind the Paranormal on AM and FM WOON Radio. And we did, I guess, cut to the commercial just in time for the soccer shot. Everybody has to wait. So,
Exactly.
Gary, please don't leave us hanging. Keep the narrative going.
Right. Well, so here we go. So Holt has been reluctant to talk about Adrian Bustinza, and I think the reason why is clear now, is because when I eventually spoke with Adrian Bustinza, and I tried for several years to get hold of him and never responded. He was a very reluctant. What he was involved in, what he saw, the way he was treated, which I'll come on to, had left, very traumatized. He didn't really want to do any kind of publicity. But I ended up eventually making contact, and I had a 4.5 hour transatlantic phone call with him. And I kind of set him up and said, look, I'm an advanced interviewer. I was an advanced police interviewer. I want to try a technique on you. And it's not hypnosis. You can't do it transatlantic. but I want you to try to concentrate, and I'm not going to interrupt you and whatever. Cutting a long story short, it was a sensational interview, 4.5 hours. And when it comes to talking about this age-old question of whether Larry Warren was there, he went, late on in the interview, went, yeah, Larry Warren was there. In fact, he was closer to the craft than I was, basically. And so he's about 20 feet away from it. Larry Warren's about 10 feet away from his craft. And he said, I don't know why they chose Larry Warren to go closer to it. But anyway, so I'm going, what? So you are saying that Larry Warren is there in this cordon around this craft? Yes. And he's closer to it than you? Yes. Basically like that. So he was corroborating something that had been, in a sense, almost vilified and debated for so many years, especially in recent years, when there's been so much vitriol. And here we have this sergeant saying, yeah, he's there, he's with me, blah, blah, blah. Now, the interesting thing about that is he was corroborating that there was a translucent type of craft there, that it was surrounded by security police officers, that it was being filmed, he said all this, and that Colonel Williams was there, the base commander, and he said Colonel Holt was there. Interesting. Now, I'm not saying it. This is a military witness saying it. And perhaps that's the reason why Colonel Holt didn't really want to mention Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, because he knew that he would say, if he was ever really interviewed properly, like I did with him, if he ever said that, it was going to put Holt in a difficult position. And because Holt has totally denied for all these years, when he retired from 1991, that there was anything to do with aliens, anything to do with the second landing, that Colonel Williams, of course he wasn't there, blah, blah, blah. But when you marry that up now with the information and admission that Ray Boucher from MUFON got in 1985, and then this new witness testimony from Adrian Bustinza that's very specific, but there is a twist. When Adrian Bustinza talks about this incident of a second landing, he says, that was another night. And I go, what? He goes, this wasn't the Holt night. This was another night. I said, let me be clear then. You're saying that you are involved in another night of UFO activity. He goes, yes. And he's not sure whether it's the next night. There might be a break, a couple of nights. But essentially what he's saying is that he is involved in another night of UFO activity. And on that other night of UFO activity that he is involved in, that's when this second landing occurs. And if you think about it, that's why it may have caused so much confusion, because people were always trying to marry Adrian Bustinza's comments that he'd maybe put out socially over the years, and John Burroughs would go, so, well, I don't remember that. Well, he wouldn't if he's not involved in this other night. And, John Burroughs would say, well, I can't remember Larry Warren being involved on the Holt night. Well, it turned out it wasn't the Holt night, according to Adrian Bustinza. Now, what I don't think we can ever nearly do now, nearly 43 years down the line, is I don't think we can ever really firm up on memories to the point where you can say, yes, that definitely happened on that day at such and such a time. That time has gone. Too many years have elapsed. Not enough investigation done early on. Memories naturally fade. But what we can be fairly certain on is people's memories. And when he was really concentrating, he really got into it. And what I would say is, in that 4.5 hours interview, that second night landing actually only played a small part of what he'd said, because for the first 3.5 hours and the first 2 hours or so, he spoke uninterrupted. Now, that's not how human language goes. But I'd set him up that way to say, look, when you're ready, I want you to concentrate and just do it as much as you can remember in whatever order you want to do, and I'm going to hand over the interview to you. And he was really concentrating clearly, and I just let him go. Now, ordinarily, people, in terms of interviewing skills, it's I speak, you speak. And that's the natural order of things. You say something, I say something in response. But when you're doing this kind of advanced interview, which is called the enhanced cognitive model, basically that first interview, that first part of the interview, you don't want to interrupt his train or his or her train of thought, because it's like walking on fresh snow. That was how it was described to me. They're relaying things, and if you come in with an interruption, it can suddenly destroy all that memory track they were on. So basically, you set them going, and off he went. And basically the first 2 hours he spoke non-stop. So in a sense, he was reliving the incident and bringing it all out. And it's one of the most powerful interviews, if not the most powerful interview I've ever done in my life, because it was so emotive. And what I'm saying about this is he talks about the fact that when he was what was called the NCOIC, which meant he was a mobile person who could be go get more Litols, go there. He was like the gopher. He could be sent everywhere. And that was, he had like a roving commission to do anything that he was ordered to do, go around the different bases, get me this, get me that. And that was called the NCOIC. And he was that on the Holt night. And what he'd basically say is that he would keep going back to the forest with more Litols or something else, and he'd keep going forwards and back. So every time he got to the forest, if something new happened, it's kind of like a new incident. Well, like I said, we can't be certain now all these years later on to times and precise dates. But what he says was that was entirely new is he said that whilst Colonel Holt and other people were close to the staging area, he was then sent out in a line of 20 other officers, say he's one of 20, in a line, you know, like if you do a forensic search for police and imagine a clear grass field and they're looking for a murder weapon or something like that on the ground, they line up in a straight line and then they all go forward together and they're looking intently down at the ground, looking to see if they can recover something. Well, essentially, that's what he did. Well, show me anywhere in the history of Rendlesham when anybody's ever talked about a 20-person line search in the forest going forward like in a sweep, and that's how he described it. So he's describing an incident that nobody's ever mentioned before, which was fascinating. And
well,
here's
Gary, can I interrupt? Before we burn up the hour, please tell us where people can get the book. It's Non-Human, The Rendlesham Forest Incidents, 42 Years of Denial. There it is. Well, we can't get it that way. Where can people buy it?
It's only available on Amazon at the moment.
Okay.
It'll ship within 48 hours. It's 500 pages, and it's the full facts about Rendlesham from a detective's point of view. And I just lay it all out there. I take sentiment out of it, and I just lay out the facts. But I make reasoned evaluations, and I draw some conclusions at the end.
We have a question.
The book of Human.
We have a question from a listener here. You got that in italics, Ben? That's our friend Peter Shelley from Bogota, Colombia.
Indeed, our Bogota connection writes to us. Gary, have you looked into the possibility that the Rendlesham case could have been some type of psyops, perhaps a test by the government to see if the security personnel could be manipulated into diverting from the base and exposing the base to an enemy commando raid, perhaps? In support of this, I offer the strange detail that you have pointed out yourself of the security personnel being made to hand over their weapons before going into the forest. This suggests to me that it was pre-planned.
There are some elements of pre-planning, but maybe not for the reasons that you speculate. In answer to your question, I addressed that in the book, and several people have speculated that it was a psyop. The trouble is that not all weapons were handed in. Colonel Holt told me that Lieutenant England carried like a little rocket launcher under his coat and was out in the forest. Other people, for example, Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, which is a story we've not talked about yet and is one of the biggest cover-ups, is that she was the officer on the second night driving on a rural public road between the twin bases, and in between was the forest. Well, she's on this British-UK public road when she is chased off the road by a sphere that's travelling alongside of her at like hedgerow height. She is so distressed by this sphere glowing ball that she loses control of the vehicle. She rolls the military vehicle into a ditch on a public road. She climbs out and the UFO stops and hovers above her. So she gets a weapon and she starts shooting at it. Well, that's a sensational new case. A female officer, a lieutenant, discharging a weapon at a UFO. And have you heard about it? No, because it was all covered up by the US Air Force. We know
we
about it
never heard
now.
that.
No, that's. Oh.
Right,
Wow.
so that's a pretty good story, that, isn't it? And that
Very
comes
much
not from,
so.
that comes from Michael Stacey Smith, who was an airman. Now, what we knew prior to is we knew that a female called Laurie Bowen had been at the East Gate and first reported on the night that this happens to Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin that something like a glowing red ball of fire had dropped into Rendlesham Forest. So she reports it on the telephone that's located at the East Gate. And the first person who happens to respond is Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, who just happens to have left RAF Bentwaters en route on the back road, public road, towards the back gate of RAF Woodbridge. Well, obviously, this is when this incident occurs. We know about it because Michael Stacey Smith basically says that he was suddenly dispatched to go to what was called the back gate of RAF Bentwaters, which was called the Butler Gate, and it led onto a little public road. And he was sent there, didn't know why, but it was all of kind of a quick rush, get out there, open up the Butler Gate, the back gate at Bentwaters. He got there, he opened up, and then he saw a convoy of security police vehicles heading out at speed. Something was clearly happening or had happened. And then a few minutes later, he's still at the back gate when Lieutenant Tamplin is brought back as a front seat passenger. The military vehicle is driven by Sergeant Robert Ball, called Bobby Ball, and she is in the front seat passenger. She's not wearing a berry. Her clothing is dishevelled. She's absolutely shaking like a leaf. Something really traumatic had happened. So he doesn't speak to her, but he sees her. So he's a direct witness testimony to part of this story. She goes in onto the bed. And then a few minutes later, the vehicle that she'd been driving, Lieutenant Tamplin had been driving, is clearly still drivable because another security police officer drives it back to the Butler Gate, and he sees her vehicle has sustained damage consistent with having rolled the vehicle onto part of the roof, and it's crumpled, but you can still drive it. He closes up the gate, and he then speaks to one of his friends who is a sergeant, and the sergeant says, if you promise never to divulge my name to anyone, I'll tell you what her story was. And he said, oh, yeah, I promise. And he kept that to his word. He never told me who this person was. But I have absolutely no reason to disbelieve Michael Stacey Smith. I am Michael Stacey Smith. And he said that she'd been on the public road, been ran off the road, affected by this glowing object, that she'd climbed out of the vehicle that had rolled in the ditch. The UFO was hovering, a spherical object, very similar to as being described by many of the airmen involved in this, like a beach ball size object, maybe bigger than this, maybe the size of a car, hovering close to her. She was so frightened. She then took a weapon, which we think was an M16, but might not be, but she had a firearm, put it that way, and she discharged a weapon. And the sergeant told Michael Stacey Smith that the rounds that she had discharged had been put back into the armoury, and it was all covered up. Her weapon was recovered, cleaned, and put back into the armoury, all covered up. So this incredible story that we've only emerged through this book has emerged now, 42 years later. So by hook or by crook, the US Air Force covered up this major incident on a public road in the UK, and they've got away with it for all these years. And there we are. We now finally know what happened to Bonnie Tamplin. We know that Bonnie Tamplin now was so traumatized that within days after this incident, she was then being flown back to the United States. And as far as we're aware, she never went back to work again. I now know that she's living in Europe. I know which country she's in, but I tried to contact her through relatives, but clearly no response. And she clearly doesn't want to talk about it. I kind of hope that after all these years, somebody might tell her that there's this book out now and that it contains a lot more military witness information, more witnesses have spoken to me, and that she might want to go on the record to exercise a ghost as much as anything else. But I can well understand it if she doesn't. But that's a sensational story that's been covered up. And so when we talk about the question instead of is it a psyop, well, that doesn't sound like a psyop to me.
Right.
And the book's conclusions are that there's 17 different incidents over that late December Christmas period. 17 different timed incidents, i.e. where there's a significant break between them, over what we now believe is 4 consecutive days. Now, let me give you something else that's really interesting that doesn't make it sound like it's a psyop. Now, on the 23rd of December, according to the military witness, there is a report that something else had happened at the East Gate. Now, this is just a couple of days prior to Christmas, so this, again, is totally unknown. Other than this book, never been reported as such. And I spoke with this witness, and he basically said he'd had a previous UFO encounter himself in what was called, I think it was the November period of 1980, so just before. And when he'd reported what he saw, he was basically given the hard word is, do not say anything about this, and he was given a lot of grief for mentioning it to the senior officers. And so he thought, well, if ever I see anything else, I am not going to tell anyone else because I don't want any more grief. But so anyway, on this, what he thinks is the December the 23rd, the night of the 23rd, he is called to he's told to go to the East Gate and speak to an airman. We think it's a security policeman. Now, quite why there is somebody at the East Gate on the 23rd of December, we're not sure, because it wasn't routinely manned, unless it was on an exercise or some kind of an alert. There may be a story behind that. But anyway, he then goes and speaks with the security police officer, who says that he'd seen something land, as in a UFO or some kind of light, and descended vertically dropped down into the forest, akin to basically what Laurie Bowen had seen a couple of nights later on the 25th, 26th into the 27th. And so anyway, the airman is very upset, doesn't want to go himself. So the 2 airmen who've responded to this incident, they go and look in this clump of trees, forest, that was closer to the East Gate than it is now. The trees are not the same now, because after 1997, 90% of the trees were all knocked down in what was akin to a British hurricane. It demolished most of the forest. So the trees aren't the same anymore. And the clump of trees that this happened is not there anymore. But he says that this clump of trees is no more than 150 metres to 200 metres from the East Gate. Well, that's not what Jim and John saw. This is much closer to the East Gate, so again, new information. And he says that when he went to the inside, they found a small clearing, and they found triangular indentations, a perfect triangle, as akin to John and Jim's indentations.
I hate to have to stop you, Gary, but we're out of time. We're going to have you back, and the book again,
Oh,
folks.
come on, I thought this was 2 hours.
No, it's 1 hour.
I thought this was 2 hours.
Oh, I'm so sorry, but we'll have you back real soon. We'll stay on
So
the edge
much
of our
more.
seats, and we'll continue. But thank you so much. Ben, I think we probably better get started with what's for next week.
Sure thing. Well, I mean, we have a wee bit of time to tell you a little bit about our show website, what we have coming up. So you can look for us at the Exeter UFO Festival in September, and for my dad at the Arizona Dowsers Conference in October. And don't forget to check out our show website, www.behindtheparanormal.com. You can find over nearly 1,200 hours of shows, of our regular shows and special broadcasts since 2008 from CBS Radio, Achieve Radio, and here on WOON, AM and FM radio. And you can also hear many of these broadcasts on major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. Don't forget to download our show app. It's free at BehindTheParanormal.com, and you can browse our books along with those of our special guest co-hosts, our show website, BehindTheParanormal.com, where you can also find out more about the show, our many cases over the years, and our public appearances. And so we'll tell you what's going on next week. So making his debut on the show next week will be author and experiencer Daniel Harari, look at that, who will share what he thinks will happen after aliens arrive.
Well, we leave, if they haven't already, we leave you today with a thought from none other than the dear old Socrates. Wonder is the beginning of wisdom. I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno, and thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we shall see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Broadcasting live and local daily from the Navigant Credit Union broadcast studio at the corner of